this one is really just for you to think about on your own, or please, again, feel free to use the chat box feature. So in a word or a brief phrase, please finish this statement. Inclusion is, or inclusion is not. And please feel free to answer both prompts or just one. So I'll just give you a few minutes to think about that.
You can put down your thoughts in the chat box so we and Kristel can understand what you feel. Margaret Paxton says inclusion is justice. Kristen says inclusion is meeting the hands of all students. John Alden says inclusion is equity. Kim Young says it's belonging. Kristen Blum says inclusion is ensuring everyone has a voice. Kimberly Yash says inclusion is broader than just LS or EAL. Inclusion is not only differentiation. Gemma says equity for all stakeholders. Barb says inclusion is opening opportunities for everyone to participate. Rachel Lang says inclusion is removing barriers to learning. And Brooke says inclusion is a basic human desire. So there are really, really interesting thoughts that are coming up in the chat, Kristel. We have Lancy who's saying inclusion is a chance for everyone to work together. Madhu says inclusion is being open-minded. Tahila is saying inclusion is open and exclusion is close. Stacy says inclusion is creating community, connection. So yeah, the chat box is just coming alive with a lot of inputs from the audience.
Thank you. And as it's mentioned, and you're seeing yourself in these chats and hearing, we know when we talk about inclusion, we're talking about all stakeholders. We're talking about our students, we're talking about our leaders, our teachers, our parents, our decision makers. And thank you. When we talk about making sure that all are included, words like equity, we think about environment, we think about our instructional approaches when we're thinking about it in a context of schooling. Social emotional inclusion, how do we make sure that we're catering to the needs and the emotional needs of our learners, our well-being? Language complexities, it's not just a matter of special needs or learning support. We think about the language diversity and the richness that comes from our diverse communities. Perceptions, what are the perceptions that exist in our communities? And that might be in our smaller school communities on a more micro level. It might be on the larger host country. It might be in general when we think about where our world is in time and place. The design that goes into setting up structures to ensure that we have a more inclusive setting. And then ultimately, what does the implementation look like? So today we are going to have an opportunity. We've just finished a brief inclusion activity, but we are going to delve a little bit more into what is inclusion, why are we doing it, and how are we going to be able to talk about it today, and what will you be able to take away? We think about our beliefs and values and where that sits when establishing the purpose for becoming more inclusive. It's a term that we know gets floated quite a bit, but what do we actually mean and where our beliefs sit with that? And the identity of ourselves as educators and the identity of the institutions that we work within. And we will have a chance to look at various models of inclusion. I'll share some resources that exist around that. And then ultimately, if you were to take this back into your setting, what might be a growth plan or a structure that you could use to facilitate discussions when you go back into your settings, as you finish out the year, as you begin and start thinking about the beginning of the new school year, and then ultimately be able to close with some questions. So what is it? What are we doing today? We're going to be thinking about how we work together as a learning community and develop not only the concept of inclusion, but this culture of inclusion, which is sometimes a bit less tangible. And why is this important? And many of you have already stated that when we went through the chat, and it's recognizing that we know all students deserve a high quality educational experience, no matter where you are in the world and no matter who you are. And how do we provide opportunities so we can recognize what pathways for individualized excellence can look like? And we will take a process that many of you will be familiar with, may be familiar with when we think about our work with organizations like the IB, and using a structured inquiry approach and looking at our beliefs and values, knowing who we are, taking an opportunity to look at some self-assessment tools, and then planning for success to move forward. So we will be using a similar approach, and this is a visual that many of you may have been familiar with and seeing this with the IB. And we will begin with kind of thinking about that tuning in. And we know that our topic here is around inclusion and our journey towards greater inclusion. So you will have an opportunity now to, again, see some of the responses and share some ideas with one another. And there's a few prompts here. These first two questions is what I'd like to start us off with. And we're going to think about what do we think when, and what do we know already? So thinking about your own particular setting, your own context, what do we think we know already about inclusion? And then when it comes to inclusion within your setting or in your school, this is what I'd like to know a little bit more about. And please feel free to think quite broadly, maybe some things that are a bit more specific to structure and implementation. And what I'll do is I'll share the view so all of you can share each other's and see each other's input. And I believe that link will be placed in the chat for you to be able to access. And we'll take a few minutes here just to allow you to type in and then have a chance to read each other's notes here. And as we broaden our discussion, there are two additional questions that I welcome you to read through and begin answering. And that really has to do more with some of our mental models, our assumptions, our fears about when we hear this term inclusion. Why schools sometimes have been a bit more hesitant to say, okay, how do we open our doors to a range of learners? And what does that mean for our community? What does that mean to our image as a community, our reputation? Does that elevate it? Do we feel equipped? And what might be some of those key components to include in this process when you do go back and have these discussions with your school, whether that starting in smaller focus groups where you have similar thinking partners, or really challenging those who maybe are thinking about it in a different way, and what might be able to support that process as you engage. And some of you have shared here, it involves a lot of work and it is hard to implement. And as a profession where we do not shy away from hard work, when we add another layer to that, it can be overwhelming. It can be quite daunting. Professional development for teachers to feel better and more prepared. So how do we ensure that when we engage in an initiative or a new approach to how we do things, that our teachers are feeling equipped, that our teaching assistants have the skills, that our parents know what this looks like for their roles in this partnership with us. We have over here embracing diversity, really making sure that in practice, not only in our words, that we embrace, and not only, sometimes we hear that term tolerate, but instead embrace and celebrate the diversity that comes with various learning profiles and language diversity, and just the richness that comes from having communities that cater to a range of students. The process of top-down decision-making and how that sets that tone for both an inclusive and exclusive outcomes. So as teachers, what does it look like in the classroom? But as leaders, how do we ensure that there are structures that support that? And I'll just read a couple more before we proceed. And we think about some of those fears. Thank you for sharing this. Sometimes we are afraid of inclusion because we are afraid of the unknown, or maybe we're afraid of not being able to control everything that happens in the classroom. And sometimes it is easier to maybe think about it like if we just kind of keep going the way that we are, and recognizing that our communities are diverse as it is, whether or not we are intentionally opening our doors to students who have varied learning profiles, we know that we have that in our communities. So how do we make sure we embrace that? And is inclusion equity? When I think of inclusion, I think of equity, giving students what they need so that they can be successful. And that can come in a range of forms. Thank you so much. And I ask that you continue to, as ideas come to you throughout this discussion today, to please continue to add to this, and that you will have access to this and see each other's thoughts. I mentioned earlier that as we think about mental models that exist around inclusion, we are coming to the table with particular experiences, some that have been more successful than others. We may have our own personal connection to being in a learning community that has supported your success or your challenges, and that you faced within a setting that was either more or less inclusive. And so making sure that we call that out and that we are able to lay that out so we know what we can address. As we dig a little bit deeper and we kind of think about, well, what does this mean for each of our stakeholders? And of course, there are many more when we think about where our operational teams within a school meet our educational teams, but just kind of pulling on our three key factors. And we think about teachers, and we think about those discussions that we would be having in our communities and saying, well, what are the skills? What are the attitudes and the behaviors that we feel are necessary to develop an inclusive culture? And that's a really intentional question, because we can think of the skill set that sometimes can come with particular trainings or professional development. But what are those attitudes and behaviors that we want to develop, that we want to nurture when we think about becoming more inclusive? And how do we support the shift to this culture? And what are the components that are going to contribute to that? When we think about our students, what are those admissions protocols? When we think about how we accept our students, how do we ensure that we know as much as we possibly can so that we can set up an environment that's going to be successful for their learning? When we know that they're going to transition, and that might be within the community, that might be out to another school, coming into our setting. And when we are considering the context of each and every classroom, this idea of mutual benefit. So sometimes a fear that is raised is what happens if we open our doors, and now we no longer have a balance that we can manage. What does a classroom look like? Sometimes we talk about this fear of attention deficit for the students who may not need as much support, because our shift of needs and support will go to a few instead of the larger group. These are considerations and thoughts that come into these discussions, and it's important that we don't shy away from them. But we talk about, what do we feel a well-balanced classroom looks like? How do we feel that we're able to support a range of learners well? Our parents, and thinking about those who are joining the community, who do we say that we are? What do we expect from their engagement, and embracing the wider diversity that comes with a larger community that has a range of learning profiles. And I don't want to only say needs, because it really is beyond that. And what can we do to support our support or types of support? How do we ensure that they feel included in the wider community and that their voices are heard? And again, ensuring that they understand the benefits and the value that comes from having such a wide range of learners. What do we create by creating a microcosm of what the world is around us, and how we prepare our students in a very supported and structured way, so that when they leave our institutions, when they leave our schools, that they have skill sets that we can't necessarily teach from books, but they know how to embrace and celebrate their peers. So what I'd like us to do as we continue this conversation is just have a think about if you were to place your school on a continuum of inclusion. And again, this is really just more simplified than we know the complexity of this topic is. But as we think about it, just from the gate of accepting students, my school is a highly selective school, no program available for children with learning differences. And that's on one end of the continuum. Or your school might be on the other side of it, saying we are actively seeking students with difference and we're providing programs that meet their needs. And of course, we have everything in between. Our admission policy allows for students with needs to be included and can provide access with some support. So what I'm going to do to ask you to engage with this continuum is to first have a read through each of these boxes, have a think about where your school may sit with this. And within the chat box, there's going to be a link. It may already have been placed in there. And you will have a chance to just create to complete a very brief Google form. And I'm going to go ahead and bring that up so that you can see that oftentimes we're much more similar than we realize. And in no way is this a race to get from one side of the continuum to the other, but more so recognizing the journey that we all are on as educators and our schools are on. So I'll just give you a moment to read through and then to go ahead and complete the form. So this is what the form will look like.
Kristel, just wanted to tell you it was not appearing on your screen.
There you go.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, and can everybody see this, the charts here?
Yes, we can see it.
Great. So what we're noticing here as we are looking at the responses as they're coming in is that we're noticing that we have many schools that are not necessarily on that farther end where they consider themselves highly selective with no programs of support. So you have a really large group, about 95%, that they are not within that particular category. And then we have a little bit more representation across our school is selective, but supports students when needs arise with limited resources. And I think this one's really helpful to see because international schools in particular don't necessarily have the same history as some national systems where there might be more legal mandates that have come into requiring schools to set up structures for a range of learners. And so this is reflective often of schools that are just beginning their journey. Maybe their history was that they were able to be a little bit more specific about who's able to come into settings, who are not, what resources and educators are they able to pull on professional development. And so we can see here that this sits a little bit more in towards that 50-50 range. And then as we go a little bit further down, our school admissions policy allows for students with additional needs to be included and provided that they can access the curriculum with minimal support. And so again, when we think about schools on their own journey, they may be able to see we can support students who have more mild, maybe even moderate needs. However, we're not yet equipped to support students with more intensive or severe learning difficulties. And so part of this process, of course, is identifying and defining what that looks like. Schools, and so there are other schools that have not necessarily gone in this direction because there have been other settings that have been structured around that. All students at our schools are included, and we seek to meet their needs within our current staffing and curriculum structures. And this is more of a belief statement when we think about what we community, and that we are really trying our best to ensure that that happens. And lastly, our school actively seeks students with learning difference and provides a program that meets their needs. And so this one, as we know, is a little bit more resource intensive. And this also has a shift, and we're going to talk a little bit about where mission and vision of the school sits. Thank you. Thank you for your responses. Okay. So I just want to check that everybody can see the slides again. As we think about our different models,
Sorry,
can you see that?
yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, no problem. So as we move in frameworks, as we think about various models of inclusion, there is not a one size fits all, and we would not be doing a service to ourselves as educators if we said that one size fits all and this is how we make it work. It's important to ensure that we are adaptive in our approach. That has really been transformational in supporting schools, and many of you have may have worked with the Next Frontier Inclusion organization. They have a guide towards inclusion that supports schools in identifying 4 areas in looking at different models and ways to work with schools to move through that. And one is building that common meaning and commitment, community commitment. So how are we using the same language? Designing and integrating the program. So this is that larger kind of balcony view of how do we design a program that supports our community and supports all of our learners? And how do we ensure our educators have that professional capacity and an ongoing professional capacity to support all of our students? And then ultimately, how do we evaluate and improve our program? And that, of course, is an ongoing process. So each of these areas are really truly parts of a whole. So coming into this conversation, you may be looking for, how do we even ensure that we have each of those puzzle pieces? We can see a picture of what we want. We can see kind of that broader view of we want to make sure all students have access, but how do we know what all of those pieces are? And by no means is this an extensive list, but there are some key components of that. And we think about that starting with our mission and vision as a school. Who do we say that we are? How do we intentionally communicate to our wider community that we are here to support every single student that we can in the best way to success look like for each individual? What are the policies and the guidelines? So really that structural component that supports sometimes what can feel like a little bit more ambiguous in some of the wording that we often have. And what does it look like for the admissions piece? And we talked a little bit about that. Staffing, who are we bringing in? Who are we recruiting? What are the skills and the attitudes and the beliefs that come with those who we're bringing in to teach our students? And really thinking specifically, intentionally about our professional development. Where does that lie? There are so many resources out there, but how do we hone in on making sure that communities, and it doesn't necessarily mean it always has to be external, and finding that expertise within our communities, within our teaching teams, and building on that experience that really already makes our learning so rich. And this idea of collaboration, it's another term when I think about inclusion that we hear often. And are we collaborating? And when we put people together, do they collaborate? What skills are necessary to ensure a highly effective collaborative relationship? And this is really an area that I encourage schools to go through and do a deep dive in, because just because we put educators really mindsets and skills and ways that we work together that we have to be thoughtful and intentional about to ensure that this is happening. Our facilities, do our facilities allow access for learners? How do we ensure that our financial picture allows for this? This can be a fear when we think about those who are making those decisions. How do we make a sustainable program? And our resources for our curriculum. Ultimately, any decision that we make should be based on data. We are looking at our learners not only based off of observational impressions, but that we really are finding multiple sources of data to support any decision that we make. Robert Dilts has a structure of nested levels of learning, and some of the things I've spoken to you already about really fit quite nicely in this. And part of that visual of these levels of learning start with mission and vision, and then move through what our beliefs and values are. When we start our conversations with our teams and we establish the similarities that we have, such as we would all agree that students deserve a high quality education, then we recognize that we're actually coming in at a similar starting point. We have a shared vision and belief around the work that we want to ensure our students have. We want them to feel successful. We want to value the time that's going to go into that. Now, the how and some of those capabilities and strategies, which are a little bit further down on this, is really sometimes where we see that tension. We get caught in the weeds a little bit on that how, which is just as important. However, it really is important to start at a place where we have similarities and we find those ways of work to ensure that we are able to do it in a very practical way. Are there languages within the mission that can sometimes become a barrier? And so starting from that level and thinking about, let's revisit what that looks like. And this is thinking about it again at that leadership level. How do we make sure that when we're starting and what we're communicating about our identity as a school aligns with the practices that we are trying to move through with our students? If you can just take a moment and think about how you might want to process this more independently, or if you'd like to include this in the chat box, what are some of the potential challenges your school community may face as you're moving towards greater inclusion based off of some of the discussions that we've had? And I'll give you just a minute or two, and there might be some that are surfacing for you. You'll be able to, maybe we can hear 2 or 3 from the chat and just see if we are seeing some trends.
Yeah, Kristel, while we wait for people to write down their thoughts, there is Anchal Alreja. She's asking if you could elaborate on what high quality education means. Sure.
So when we think about, again, coming from, this is a mixture of both personal impressions and when we think about what research has shared with us, a high quality education is ensuring that all students have access to a range of resources. So sometimes what will happen is we might limit what we think a child might be able to do, and that's based on our own personal impressions. But how do we ensure that they have access so that they are really drivers to their own success? How do we make sure that those resources are available to them, that the learning environment is supportive of their social and emotional well-being? So taking it beyond the academic resources and materials that they need to have access to, but also that that emotional setting is supportive of them being able to drive and feel motivated to carry themselves through no matter where their starting point is. And that's how I would define a high quality education.
Okay. Thank you for that, Kristel. We have a lot of thoughts coming into the chat box. Adriana says the challenges for her are standardized tests. And John says the challenge, I think, inside the school is having the kids or students in extreme, highly performing and really low performing students. Adriana again lets us know that for her, another challenge is the limited curricula. And some people also are saying a clear lack of policy. Right.
Thank you. And one of the points, thank you for sharing, is that that continuum of learners where we have that full range of students who are really high performing, and how do we ensure that we're challenging them appropriately, and those students who really need more specific and targeted support. And then we have those students in the middle, which is sometimes we think that's who we're teaching to, and we know we end up kind of missing out on everybody if we kind of aim for this false average or this false middle. And so how do we think about the structures of our classrooms? How do we think about creating programs that can still support those students who need to be pushed, how do we have that flexible grouping where it doesn't mean that all of those heterogeneous or mixed groups are always the best arrangement in all classrooms all the time. We want to be flexible with that. So we are thinking about how do we allow students to support and push one another, kind of open up what sometimes our mental models are of what a classroom should look like. How do we flexibly report and assess on students? We think about the universal design for learning and creating multiple access points. And then of course the outcomes, do they all need to be assessed in the same way? When you think about what is it that we are actually assessing, is it their writing? Is it the content of their writing? And really being very deliberate about what that looks like so that we can create flexible learning opportunities and experiences that really cater to each of our learners in the classroom. It's also really an important piece when we talk about standardized testing. This is something that is not necessarily driven by us as teachers, but how do we use that data to really push and support some of those policies that sometimes may not always be aligned exactly with where we are and where our population is. So in kind of taking this conversation a bit further and planning for opportunities for growth, some of those pieces that you've already noted are, what's the plan? What are some of those resources? So this might be a template or a way of using a way of structuring a conversation, and who is that conversation with? Who needs to be at the table? And when we think about, okay, if we're having a plan for growth, this is not only necessarily a plan for immediate or significant change, but recognizing growth, that in itself can adjust our expectations and pressure that we put on ourselves. What are some of the resources and tools that we might need? And that might be professional learning. It might be finding resources that are out there that have supported our work in the past, identifying some of those obstacles which have just been noted here already. And where's that change? Is that change at a higher kind of belief and values level, or are we thinking about more of our practice? Do we need to think about where our principles sit? Have we identified what our principles of learning and instruction are? And why is this needed? And then once we've been able to do that and kind of take us through this discussion and kind of filling this out. And here's a sample that I've included, and this is looking more at students who may need to have that extension that need to be pushed even further. So looking at the continuum, we don't always necessarily think about our students who need to be enriched as well as our students who, or extended, as well as our students who need more specific support. So as you fill this out together and kind of brainstorm through this, this really helps to support the discussion where it doesn't become one-sided. It's a brainstorming opportunity. It really surfaces where the community is and where the school maybe currently is and where they're going. Where does professional development sit with this? What are the skill sets that exist? Now, when we think about this on the inquiry cycle and we think about it, the skill sets exist within our community. We have educators who have just such a wide breadth and depth of experience, and how do we pull on that? How do we make sure that we have structures that support collaborative discussions? And then what are the structures and systems that exist that are going to support our work? Take a moment here, and we're just going to have more of a personal thought on this as we start to draw conclusions. And again, take them back to your setting. You can use this to facilitate these discussions. What might be some of the key components for you to include in this process for your school? Each of our schools have our own context. We have our own set of strengths as well as challenges. And what might that be for your particular setting? And surfacing that to support the discussions very honestly and openly. And as we come full circle for really thinking about leading an inclusive culture, and we think about some of the discussions that we've had and the points that you've seen amongst one another, all of the students that we know, does that why statement still sit and still permeate as a very relevant point? Are all students deserving access of a high quality educational experience? And that question was posed. What look question that can go on the table? What is a high quality educational experience? Do you all share the same view on that? And if not, what are the components that you do agree on? And how do you engage in some of that safe cognitive conflict where you talk about, well, this is not necessarily what I would consider as a high quality component of that experience? And then how might you be able to think about, if our end goal is to ensure that every student feels that they have a pathway to success, what are those pathways? How do we create or support those pathways? Is everybody heading in the same direction? And is it okay that they're not? And if it is, then how do we make sure that we create those opportunities? These discussions aren't only amongst the educators at the table. This is important to engage parents, really getting a sense of where they are, what their hopes are. We know that we're preparing students for a world that we don't know where it's going. We don't know what jobs are going to exist. Things are changing so quickly. So how do we make sure that we're pulling on the interest and expertise from all of our stakeholders? Sometimes with these high level conversations, we forget about that voice that is so key, which is our students. In what ways can we engage our student voice? And how do we pull in their views of where they see themselves going? They're going to be telling us more than we could ever imagine and come up with ourselves. We base our decisions oftentimes on our own experience. What about theirs? And how can you really think as a school to incorporate that in an appropriate and age appropriate way where they feel heard? And then in that, how might those discussions and those experiences really support and validate your beliefs and values around inclusion, maybe surface new ones, clarify where your identity is as an individual and as an educator? What are you passionate about? And then what does that look like for your school and how you all work together as educators? And part of that can be through a range of self-assessments. And so I am going to share with you a few tools that might be supportive and resources that might be helpful to facilitate. It is very much a journey, and a journey that is meant to take time and to be thoughtful and not rushed. There is not a clear destination where you feel that you're finished, but instead that you know that you're moving forward. And just thinking about those, where that transformational change exists. That transformation in thought, in policies and guidelines that have been informed by those discussions around where your beliefs and values sit. And then, of course, moving into that informational change. These are the behaviors that and skills and capabilities that will inevitably adjust and adapt once we feel that we've kind of met ourselves where we're clear about our values as an institution. Although it can be gone without, we can go ahead without saying, but I think it is important to know as leaders of a classroom, as leaders of a school, wherever your role or capacity is within this, how do you model it? How do you acknowledge your own perceptions and fears? How do we model that flexibility in thinking, in practice? The more efficacious we feel in our practice, the more empowered we are to lead others. And we can see that in one another. And really not to underestimate the power of reflection. Sometimes we get on this train and we keep going and going and going and say, wait a minute, have we stopped? Have we recognized and honored all of the great work that we've done and the success that we've had up to this point, the changes that we've made, while still being aspirational, but they don't need to be an either or. And making sure that in order to move forward, we do need to reflect on what's gone well, where we need to grow, and how that will continue to move ourselves in the right direction. And as I close with you, just thinking about this particular quote, change is to lead us to live dangerously, because when leadership counts, when you lead people through difficult change, you challenge what people hold dear, their daily habits, tools, loyalties, and ways of thinking, with nothing more to offer, perhaps, than a possibility. And I think this quote just really allows us to find that balance of being aspirational, but also giving ourselves a chance to be okay with progress as much as, leaps and bounds or small baby steps, and looking at it through the eyes of how we notice that in our students, and then make sure that we do that and apply it to ourselves.